Hello class, and welcome to the Soundbites video for week 3. This week I'm titling The Rise of the Bands, the British Invasion, because we'll be focusing on bands that are rock and roll in genre, but come not from the United States, like Elvis and Little Richard and Chuck Berry, but actually from the United Kingdom, and then gain popularity over in the United States, which is a phenomenon known as the British Invasion. So bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and as we'll also be seeing, Fleetwood Mac could sort of be thought of as part of this wave of British rock coming to really rise to prominence in the United States. Now, another band that we'll be covering, the Beach Boys, is not a British band, so you might be wondering, what is it doing here? Well, as I mentioned, the course has sort of been reorganized in terms of the course schedule and what topics we're covering where, and I just really couldn't leave the Beach Boys out, but they also didn't really fit into these sort of larger paradigms, and this is chronologically about where they arise. So we'll be starting with the Beach Boys, who are from Southern California, and it's very much an American band. But they also do fit with these other bands in that we see the rise of this phenomenon of the rock band as sort of an artist group, whereas before, if you remember, whether it was Rosetta Tharpe or Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, you normally had the focus on these soloists, right, or the frontmen, a sort of singular artist who defined the sound and defined the songs, rather than a collective band. And so when we get to the Beach Boys, we see that start to shift with more of an attention to the group, the Beach Boys together. And then, of course, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, those main headliners for the British Invasion. And then Fleetwood Mac, which is one of the most enduring classic rock or, sort of bands from this time period, also reflecting this British sensibility coming back to the United States. Now, one word on that is that when we look at the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Fleetwood Mac, all these British Invasion bands, what we see is the United Kingdom sort of capturing this element of sound that is very, very heavily influenced by the music of the American South, such as we saw with Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and the like. Specifically, blues music, blues and rhythm and blues. So we have these elements of sound coming from the United States over the radios and over the record sales and the like, and being captured in the United Kingdom, sort of re-transformed, redigested, and reinterpreted, and then brought back to the United States in the form of these bands, things like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And as a result, it sort of is a sound that is at once familiar and old, but then at the same time new and different. And so I think that's a big part of what causes this sort of cultural phenomenon around the British Invasion. So when we see things like the Ed Sullivan Show and the Beatles performing on it, which kicks off this cultural phenomenon of Beatlemania, I think they're tapping into something that, again, is at once both familiar and accessible to their audiences, but then maybe repackaged in a new and different way. Along the way, these British Invasion bands and other bands give us a good opportunity to consider the dynamics of a rock band within the industry. And that means things like needing a manager or needing recording engineers, interpersonal dynamics within the band and how bands maybe break up, change membership, and reform. All these things are important things to talk about in the history of rock and of popular music more generally. Now, what I find interesting is having started with sort of these more solo artists like Little Richard and the like, we now are transitioning more into a time of bands, where the bands and the groups are going to be the main artistic unit. And then arguably, when we get back to the present day, we see more of a shift back towards those solo artists, who are still backed up by quite a creative team, but sort of with one front-facing person who defines the sound and defines the songs. So, these things come and go in pendulums and in waves, and so I think that's an interesting one to keep in mind. Alright, now I'm going to kick it over to me from the past of various weeks, and you'll hear about those 4 bands that I mentioned. Next we go from New York City to Southern California, and we look at surf rock. Now, surf rock sort of has 2 main manifestations, and I think talking about the split and difference between the two also points to similar divides within surf culture as well, or within what surfing meant to different subcultures in Southern California. So let's start with Dick Dale, who is called the king of the surf guitar, and he aimed to capture the feel of surfing itself. Usually his tone was very heavy, and he had a percussive electric guitar style that was drenched in wet reverb, and so metaphorically speaking, his music sounded very much like the feeling of crashing in the surf. Now, Dick Dale himself was influenced by Lebanese and Polish stringed instruments, and also from big band jazz drums, and so his influences were quite diverse that he sort of synthesized into this signature electric guitar sound. Dick Dale was known for making a number of innovations in electric guitar playing. He had a Stratocaster guitar that he called the Beast because he had very high gauge strings, that is very thick strings on his electric guitar, and this produced more heavy sound and more tension, especially on the low strings. It's also important to note that he played electric guitar left-handed, but instead of having a special instrument made for him, he took a right-handed guitar and flipped it upside down, so he just played it upside down. This tended to emphasize the bass tones with a heavier stroke, while the treble tones had sort of a softer, more round tone to them. Now, the guitar amplifier company Fender developed a custom 100-watt amp specifically for Dale because of his reputation of blowing up amp after amp. That is, if you turn up the gain from the electric guitar too high and it's more than the amplifier can take, you can destroy the amp. And so they created a special high-capacity amp for him to use. Now, Dick Dale's prominent song Meeserloo, which you can hear in the Spotify playlist, was famously sampled by the Black Eyed Peas. Definitely check this out in the playlist and you'll recognize the sample pretty much straight away. And he was also called the father of heavy metal for the way that he would really wail on the electric guitar and have a percussive and rhythmic emphasis style. So in comparison to someone like Chuck Berry, whose guitar licks were very classy and sophisticated, Dick Dale was more about just really ramming into and strumming heavily on the electric guitar. And so this was seen as having some resonances or influences upon the formation of heavy metal. So Dick Dale is one vision of what surf culture means or what it means to surf. And so now let's look at a very different take on what surfer subculture meant. And that would be the Beach Boys. So I'm guessing many of you are familiar with the Beach Boys, and they do originate from this period of the early 1960s. They presented a very different take on Southern California surf culture than Dick Dale. If you could put it this way, if Dick Dale was giving more of the sound of being in the water and wiping out, the Beach Boys were more like the sound of being on the beach and driving around Pacific Coast Highway in fancy cars. The Beach Boys perfected a formula for writing popular songs, which focused on themes of girls, cars, and surfing. Most of their songs use two or more of these themes in combination. The Beach Boys rose to fame in the early 1960s. However, they had a troubled career due to family abuse, particularly the Wilson brothers' father, and the songwriter Brian Wilson's own struggles with alcoholism and depression, resulting in a hiatus from touring. During this time, Brian Wilson's creativity was hard at work, resulting in the album Pet Sounds in 1966. This album, though received rather lukewarmly at first, has now been considered a highlight of artistry and audio production on par with the Beatles albums, such as Abbey Road or Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Now, the Beach Boys' career, they reached their height from 1962 to 1966, and ultimately declined when other popular boy bands like the Beatles took the spotlight. However, they continued touring till the 1990s as a nostalgia group, and lived off of residual sales of their records from the time.